Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, and welcome back to Midweek Through a Scottish Prism. I hope you and yours are well. Nice to have you back. You know how we do these at the weekend. We tend to focus very much on Scottish issues, and in the midweek we like to look further afield so we can broaden our knowledge, because when we do rejoin the world, we need to know what's happening out there. We need to be ready for it. So I'm joined, but there's a couple of things I want to say. First, you all know how I feel about coincidences. They don't happen. However, today, my two guests were actually put by one of them. I've got to tell you, it was one of them that said this, not me, I didn't make it up, but two gingers gone white-haired. They both went to Queen Margaret University. They both worked at STV Studios. They were both in the Parliament in the first instance in 1999. So a heck of a lot of coincidences there. And as the other one also said, they've known each other since they were embryos. It's my great pleasure to invite in and welcome Lloyd, of course, and Mark Hirst.
Hi there, Roddy.
How are we, Lloyd? Oh, we've not got a picture yet of Mark. I've got a picture down here, but I haven't got his picture in here. Have you? Can you all see Mark? Or is it just me?
No, he'll be here in a minute, I'm sure.
Why? Techie, help me. I don't know what's going on here. Anyway, Mark, can you hear us? Apparently not.
There we go.
Oh, there we go. We're in.
Fantastic.
Welcome, Mark. Welcome. As it was indeed, so the viewers knew. Well, I wasn't me. You were the one that said we're two gingers who are now white and known each other since we were embryos.
Lloyd didn't know, but I was actually his stunt double.
Yeah, there is also a resemblance. I mean, I don't know. Maybe your dad had a fast bike. Who knows? Who knows? Gentlemen, it is a pleasure, as always, to welcome you here to show. It's been a long while, Mark, since we've seen you on here. Nice to have you back.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been. I've been busy.
Yes, indeed you have. Gentlemen, I want to discuss the going-ons in both Ukraine and in Palestine. But I'll start with Ukraine, if I may. When I was advertising this show, Mark, I put up this particular thing from Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, said if Ukraine joins NATO, either Ukraine disappears or NATO disappears. Do you think he's bluffing?
No, I think you've always. It doesn't matter what politicians say in it, but I think you've often got to look beyond the rhetoric. I mean, who out of all of the senior Russian diplomats, I think Lavrov probably carries the most gravitas. I think he is a thoughtful, intellectual individual. There's no doubt about that, and so I think that's more designed probably at Western audiences. I think the worry is, obviously there is a hot war very much happening in Ukraine and along the border as well. And the danger is, there was another comment from Lavrov yesterday, I don't know if you picked that up, but basically saying that they think that if Zelensky falls, then the US will be involved in a direct conflict with Russia at that point. Now, obviously, it depends what's going to happen with this election that's taking place. Trump, although I don't favour either of the candidates. Trump's clearly insane, I think. I've seen him up close and personal, actually, when he opened his golf course through in Turnberry, and seen him in the flesh and seen him when the cameras were pointing elsewhere. It's terrifying, actually, that person would ever be allowed anywhere near power. But he has said, he is on record as saying that he's very determined to end that conflict and end the funding of it as well. So that would bring it to a very swift end. The trouble they've got is, and it's the trouble that we had when the US were arming ISIS and elsewhere, is that these weapons that they've been supplying them are going to be kicking around. And I could very much see a situation where disaffected Ukrainians who have given them all. They've seen their comrades, their family members being killed in this war that's been ultimately promoted by the United States. Them being pretty hacked off at the end of that, and they could find a situation that the US and the West, and certainly European powers, where those weapons that have been supplied get turned on Western populations.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. The other thing is, Lloyd, the Americans are well renowned for cutting and running. And one of the things, the great phrases from Henry Kissinger, which said to be an enemy of America can be dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal, as can be vouched for by such luminaries as Saddam Hussein, who was a great flavour of the month for the Americans when he was fighting Iran. And it didn't take them long to attack him, arrest him, hang him. Zelensky should be aware that the Americans are not great when things go wrong.
I think Zelensky is very well aware of that, but then again, he is the actor who got the most extraordinary role that's ever been offered to anyone. That in itself kind of fixes Ukraine in a point in history where you have someone who at one point in the year is a television comedian, and the next point in the year is the president and ruler of the country. It's quite an extraordinary situation. But I think what concerns me most of all at the moment is the potential for escalation, particularly when we have people discussing the concept of limited nuclear war. Now, I think very specifically that the control of the information coming to particularly the United Kingdom from Ukraine, or what we're allowed to see via the BBC, with the reduction in Al Jazeera, the removal of RT, people are not really fully aware of what's going on. I think we all kind of agree on that. So we've got ourselves to a point where there is actually the discussion of the possibility of an escalation leading to effectively what would be a world war, as if it was a normal thing. The discussion of the use of long-range weapons against Russia from the Ukraine provided by the West, we're talking about these things without putting them into the context. I mean, the context is exactly the same context that led us to the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 60s, that led the world to the point of nuclear war. That is basically putting the forces of the West directly on the border of what was then the Soviet Union, what is now the Russian Federation. But I think as I get older, and also as a father, what worries me most about this is commentators who normally would be accepted as being intelligent for the contribution they make are actively talking on television and on radio and in the mainstream press about the concept of a limited nuclear war. How have we got to the stage where the discussion of the loosing of nuclear weapons in mainland Europe is an acceptable concept? And I think that for me, this is what this really shows, that when you control the information about a war, you can actually get to the point where the timetable is running, and that in actual fact, you can see in the circumstance we're in at the moment how things get out of control, particularly when you have a new set of politicians from the UK who clearly, in their first 100 days, have shown that they've not really paid attention at all to what's happening on the foreign stage, other than to follow slavishly the NATO and American line.
Yeah. It's a fact here that, Mark, since October 7th and the Israeli conflict kicked off, Ukraine's sort of become the forgotten war almost. The media, particularly in the US, are focused so much on the Middle East and that victim Israel, which we'll come to later. They're kind of forgetting about Ukraine. There's almost as if people are getting bored with it and fed up with it. And in fact, I read an article that was talking about Ukraine is expendable. It's nothing personal. It's just business. And America's decided now that it's not good for business. They should be aware that the Americans will cut and run.
Yeah, I mean, the Seymour Hersh, the acclaimed American journalist who maintains, he's renowned for maintaining very high level contacts within the Pentagon and elsewhere. He wrote fairly recently, just a couple of months ago, that the contacts that he had already decided that they were going to cut Zelensky loose. And the question really now is what they do with him and how they come to a settled agreement. We're not hearing much on the media about it. And the reason for that is on the ground militarily, the Ukrainians are getting absolutely hammered. There's no question Russia has also suffered big losses, in large part due to the supply of Western weaponry to them. But they were never going to lose that conflict. You know, they were quite clear from a long time ago. But bearing in mind, you know, it's a bit like we'll see this with the Israeli propaganda narrative as well. They have their own fixed point of when the conflict started. For obviously Western audiences, they believe it's with the so-called special military operation that Russia undertook. But it happened a lot longer than that. During the 2014 coup, even before that, there was people warning the National Endowment for Democracy, which you know was the kind of propaganda arm. The National Endowment for Democracy, I've written extensively about them. Basically, American-backed, US Congress-backed organization that supposedly on the face of it, promote democracy, but in actual fact promote NGOs that subvert governments that are deemed to be hostile to American US national interest. And they're not just active in like Russia or China or faraway places. The French a few years ago actually put in a formal diplomatic objection to the work that the National Endowment for Democracy was doing in France. And they've been active here in the United Kingdom as well. And so we've got to be aware to these threats. You know, what is American national interest? Well, it's basically everywhere. They want to exert their influence everywhere. So the process that we saw in Ukraine, again, it was part of this general strategy they had to encircle, and ultimately they want to dismantle Russia. That is their objective. And they're playing a very dangerous game. My big concern, a bit like Lloyd is mentioned as well, is where the rhetoric gets cranked up to an extent where it starts to saturate into their actual thinking. And this is true of all big global leaders. The problem is that they all have such huge personal financial wealth that it's not inconceivable that they think they can insulate themselves from the very worst possible outcome, even if it's unintended consequences. And that unfortunately, the price for that is picked up by everyone else. And that's the danger. I feel the world's getting run by genuine, absolute psychopathic gangsters who have no real interest in their populations. And you touched a little bit on the economic influence. You know, they are losing money now. They've started to lose money big time in the US. And but in actual fact, 37 US states, their armaments factories have seen increased output. They've seen increased profits. I think this is part of the reason that Biden's been so keen to promote it, because a lot of them are in key states as far as the Democrats are concerned. But that's all going to change if Trump comes in.
Yeah, he has. Lloyd said that, you know, he will stop it in a day. You know, I mean, that's just absolute arrogance. I mean, what the people in the West don't realise is simply this: that this war will end, in my humble opinion, when the Russians decide. The Russians will dictate the terms. The West lost. NATO has been beaten. Now, that might not sit comfortably with a lot of people, and I'll no doubt be getting lots of you're a pro-Putinist and a Russian propagandist. This is just the reality, that the Russians will determine when and how it finishes. Nobody else.
I don't think there's any question. You're right, Roddy. I mean, if you combine what's actually happening on the ground, the deafening silence on the BBC about what's occurring in the Ukraine, but we know that militarily the Ukraine is losing and losing badly. Last week we had the big meeting of the BRICS organization. If you combine the economic power of BRICS, the diplomatic power of BRICS, and the collapse of the Ukrainian regime, we're looking at big changes in the world. And we can't be insulated entirely from those changes that are coming. The UK approach and our media's approach appears to be that whatever existed yesterday will exist forever. Hence the idea of Great Britain, the idea of the European Union constantly existing. When in actual fact, the power balance is changing. Mm-hmm. But what's worrying about that is what is going to be the response from the West to that power change. You know, effectively, we've been living in a kind of quasi-American empire since round about 1975. You know, when they pulled out of South Vietnam. The reach and the extent of American military power is huge, and it appears now not to be as it was to facilitate US business and US capital. It now appears to be about the protection of this mythological concept they have of themselves as the world policeman. While at the same time we've got this US election going on, and whenever you see interviews with, you know, what we call vox pops, ordinary people in the street, the least of their concerns are what's happening in the Ukraine, other than what they would term the willful waste of their money, and they also seem to have a less than interested approach towards what's happening in Palestine and Israel. Now that says to me that there is a big change here. But how is America going to respond to this change? Is it going to respond like the adolescent it has in the past by lashing out? Or will other forces be able to temper it slightly? It's interesting at the moment the way certain countries appear not to be distancing themselves from America, but seeking out maybe an escape route. The number of countries that are having backdoors talks or backstairs talks with the BRICS organizations. Now, not to be too negative about it, but it really is going to be, what is the European Union and the United States, the so-called Western economic bloc, what is going to be their response to this development of BRICS? Will it be a response based on accepting the economic and social challenge, or will it be, as what history has shown us, it will require, will America move immediately, or not immediately, but move towards a military kind of rejection of the BRICS concept?
Yeah, it's a worry. I mean, I saw an article recently with the Prime Minister, President of Malaysia, who Blinken was visiting him, the American member of the State Department, Mark, and openly, I feel now that a lot of the countries, particularly in the global south, are getting braver, if you like, because he turned around and told Blinken where to go. Literally, he said, you know, we're a sovereign nation. You don't come here and threaten and tell us anymore. We want relationships with China. We want relationships with Russia. We want relationships with America, the EU. We choose. You don't tell us who and when and why we can deal with. So, you know, with the fall of the American empire, if you like, the weaknesses that are being exposed daily, and the growing strength and multipolarity coming from BRICS, etc., it does seem to be making the southern nations a bit braver.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think part of the fact is the geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting quite dramatically, and I think part of the American military posturing that we're seeing as well is a response to that in a way. The big problem that America is going to have is that they could paint themselves into a box where they're left with absolutely no other alternative than to lash out on a huge scale militarily. I mean, where are the big? I mean, Kissinger's often quoted as a big international diplomatic figure, when in actual fact he was a more warmongering, genocidal, psychopathic maniac, in my view. There's other views out there. That's my view. And but where are the big diplomatic figures calling for a negotiated peace? You know, where are those? Where is that thinking taking place? All we're getting is pretty high stakes rhetoric, and the danger is, from the US perspective, is that they paint themselves into such a box. They rank their rhetoric so high up that they can't step back from that and then seek a peaceful negotiated settlement. I mean, it's one of the things that's tied in many ways to what's happening in occupied Palestine. But the even the concept, the rule of law, the international rule of law, concepts of that have been enshrined and regarded as precious in the past internationally on crimes against humanity, genocide, all these things have been absolutely trampled over by what is American foreign policy objectives, both in Ukraine, both in Palestine. I mean, we can blame Zelensky, we can blame Ukraine, we can blame Netanyahu and the Israelis, but all of this is driven from Washington. It's all driven by the United States, because they could end those conflicts and that violence and the horror instantly, but they're choosing not to.
Yeah, because as Snowden put it, Lloyd, they don't want to win wars; they want constant wars, because that's where the money. We're talking about all these, was it 35 or 37 states? It's about make it, follow the money, folks, and it's disgusting. I mean, I was saying that there were people, pundits, writing saying, well, the Ukraine war will come to an end, but not before the election in November the 5th. This was like 10 days out. Now, we now know that over 2,000 Ukrainians are dying every day. We don't know the Russian numbers, but 2,000. So 20,000 were to die so the Americans wouldn't look bad before polling day. It really is quite disgusting.
It's appalling that so much of our lives, so much of people's lives across the world are effectively dictated to by an electoral cycle. If it's not the electoral cycle within your own country, it's the electoral cycle in the country that your country is a client of. So for us, UK, GB, what goes on in the American election is of importance to us. It shouldn't be as important as it is, but it is. But I would just like to remind folk, last year, Roddy, I think it was last year, you did a programme with a midweek special of Prism with Colonel Anne Wright, who was not only a very senior American diplomat, but she was part of that structure of the United States that has a plan for each country in the world. And I remember very clearly that you kind of off the cuff said to her, well, is there a plan for Scotland? And she said very clearly, there is a plan for Scotland in the same way as there is a plan for every single country in the world. Now, these plans don't change whether it's Kamala Harris that's in the White House or whether it's Donald Trump. These plans, and it was clear from what Colonel Wright said, these are plans which are in place and are revised practically on a yearly basis by the Department of Defense and the Department of State, irrespective of who's in the Senate, who's in the Congress, or who's in the White House. And I think this is the thing that we have to start reminding ourselves of. Everyone has these ideas that if Harris wins, this will happen, and if Trump wins, that will happen. When in reality, there's a certain continuity in the United States, and it's the continuity we need to be focusing on, not on the personalities. The personalities will have influence of that. There is utterly no question. But it's the continuity line. And I think in some ways, America, in its foreign policy behaviour and in its projection of itself, wants to obscure that particular line. It wants us to lock into the electoral cycle, to get into the idea that every 4 or 5 years, things will change, when in reality, since 1975, I see no change whatsoever. If anything, I see a developing extremism in American foreign policy, and particularly its use of its military in a standoff sense, but also its use of proxies as well. It's a return to some of the things that happened in the 1970s with the Americans' interference in many countries and the amount of times they carried out regime change. But back then, we knew what it was about. It was about facilitating American capital. I'm not certain, as I said earlier, I'm not certain that American policy, as I can see it from where I'm sitting, is still about the projection and the protection of American capital. It seems now to me that they find themselves so rapidly in their imperial adventure at the point that Britain found itself post First World War, which was, you are on the way down, and you have to accept that, but there is no acceptance from them. America seems to now be in the position where it's operating in the world and flexing its muscles as a means of telling the world that its empire is still strong, it's still robust, and it will continue. When in reality, everybody around and all the mood music tells us that the very opposite is happening. In some ways, is the American military like Nero playing the fiddle while everything around them burns? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, because if you actually think about it, I mean, I saw a video yesterday of Biden coming off a plane and walking down the runway, stomping away. Like it was actually embarrassing. My heart went out to the man, and he was walking into, and there was some of the Secret Service guys trying to usher him back round like sheepdogs with sheep. And the fact is that we've had a non-functioning president in the United States, to confirm your point, Lloyd, and the United States keeps going, nothing changes. The president's not functioning, but it just keeps going business as usual. But one of the other things, Mark, that they're going on about, and they do all the time, it seems now in America, well, the Russians and the Chinese are interfering in our elections, and it's terrible. Well, we know that Labour people have been going over there, and Cole Hamilton's been going over there to interfere in the election, nothing said. And we also know that Israel openly with AIPAC and spending billions of money they get from America, they send back to America to bribe. AIPAC, no one's complaining about foreign interference from Israel in their elections, and that's the biggest interference that America gets in their elections.
Yeah, I mean, they in some ways that's all a bit of a red herring. The interference. I mean, it's happened for a long, long time. Politicians coming over here. We saw it very blatantly during the independence referendum here as well. Interference. The Americans have a register of foreign actors. There's a formal register. I remember when Sputnik and RT were placed on it at the time in the US. And then when you look at the list, the British tourist agencies are also on it and stuff. So it's basically anyone that's regarded as potentially having a commercial or economic adverse effect on the United States is shoved on this list. But the big problem is the money. We should be really following the money back. And it's like Lloyd said, these people are figureheads. It's the people behind them we need to look very, very carefully. I think it's a very interesting dynamic that Elon Musk coming in to the whole thing and trying to exist, almost like one of these bizarre Hollywood films you would see about some media baron coming in to influence and set his own agenda. But in the back of my head, again, I go back to this point of the wealth that these people have, and again, the decisions that they're involved in the kind of influence they're trying to take. I mean, Elon Musk is very, very actively involved in a program to escape this earth. It's almost like he knows something bad is going to happen, so that these people think that they've got the wealth, whether it's a massive bunker. Somebody told me that some of them are looking to build massive, big underground bunkers just in case the worst happens as a little insurance policy. But what it means for the rest of us is none of them are invested in the outcome for the rest of the planet, and that's true of not just in the political geopolitical level, but also in the climate level as well, on what's happening with climate change. I mean, no one's, for all these. I don't want to go down the whole green route. The Greens have soiled their copybook pretty badly, unfortunately, undermined the key message. If Carlos Alba was giving them some consultancy advice, I'm sure he would repeat that. But the bottom line is the planet is in a desperate state with the environment. I mean, you're seeing it, Roddy, in Spain. We can see it elsewhere in the world, and obviously conflict doesn't help that. That should be, you don't need the brains of an archbishop to work that out. When you've got bombs going off, and if God forbid, we have a nuclear exchange, limited or not, then it's tea cakes for everyone.
It is, the Israelis have, it seems, all the Western governments in their back pocket, Lloyd.
Yes. I mean, a bold statement, Roddy, but unfortunately, absolutely true. And nothing. I mean, for those of us who thought that was true up to a certain extent prior to October of last year, I've just witnessed in the past year the ability that Israel has to manipulate the to manipulate the news, to manipulate the political agenda, to manipulate particular individuals, where people are saying things which, on the one hand, are completely and utterly absurd and inhuman, and on the other hand, they present themselves as being the way forward. I mean, I find the influence of Israel is a natural product of its defense strategy. Everything Israel does is about the protection of the sovereignty of the state of Israel. Absolutely everything, including, from diplomacy to re-barcoding materials that actually come from Palestine. Everything is geared up to the protection of the Israeli state, because fundamentally Israel knows it doesn't and should not exist. They know that. So what's required by them is projection. I've said this on a number of occasions when talking about Israel. Israel starts off from the premise that everybody is their enemy. Absolutely everybody is their enemy. Therefore, you have to have information, you have to have intelligence on all of those elements that are a danger to you, the state of Israel. If that means suborning politicians, if it means suborning the military, if it means stealing military secrets, as they have in the past, if it means stealing tech secrets, Israel will do this because it's about Israel's defense. They see everything in terms of nobody likes us, everybody hates us, we don't care. It's practically the Millwall. Israel are the Millwall fans of international diplomacy. That's just a reality. It's the way they see themselves. But how can they see themselves in any other way? When you move back, you went from Europe to the Middle East and took someone else's country. Now, you may have done it with the approval of certain guilty elements in Europe at the time, but the basics are the same. You went somewhere else and you took someone's country. Inherently, they know that the people who they stole the country from are going to fight them back. So what they're doing in this war at the moment is they're trying to kill as many people as they possibly can, particularly those, women and children. Women create children, children grow up. If Israel kills sufficient women and sufficient children in this particular massacre, this particular genocide, one of many since 1947, then they can then make a calculation as to how long it will be before they finally eradicated what they term the Palestinian problem. Now, if you're dealing with a country that thinks in those terms, that has the reach that it has, I mean, even to here in Scotland, it's now become very, very clear in the past 2 to 3 years that there has been a developing pro-Israel, dare I suggest, Zionist influence in our politics at a number of different levels. Now, the change here is that there was always concern within politics in Scotland about the issue of the occupation of Palestine. I mean, one of the great contributors to medical aid for Palestine over the years, historically, 50, 60 years of support has come from Scotland, partly from ordinary people, some from the trade union movement, but primarily from the churches. So we've had a connection and we've been involved. We have attempted to understand what the circumstances are, and we've attempted to help. But in the end, what we find the price of that is we have Israeli interference in our politics. I mean, not to put, to go on too much about it, but just to finish off on this, you currently have a situation where the head of communications for the Scottish National Party government is a self-declared Zionist and former member of the executive of the European Union of Jewish Students. Now, I find I cannot for the life of me understand, number one, why someone who has no, physical or genealogical connection to Scotland would want to come here and become a forceful part of the movement for independence. I don't understand that. But what I also don't understand is how possibly after the debacle that was created with the foreign affairs, not foreign affairs, the external affairs and constitution minister of the Scottish government meeting with representatives of the Israeli embassy, that caused a stushy. But here we are, 3-4 weeks later, and the First Minister has announced that his head of communications is someone who's a self-declared Zionist. I mean, what exactly what is going on here? If that is not Israeli influence, if that's not Zionist influence at the heart of our government, then what the hell is?
Mm-hmm. I agree. I mean, Francesca Albanese, Mark, the UN Special Rapporteur for Palestine, said that Israel should be suspended. That there is, there's genocide, there's war crimes. They should be absolutely suspended. They should be, but it isn't going to happen. The UN is actually a toothless organisation, which is just a plaything of the US and its satellite nations.
Well, the US is still able to exert absolutely a huge amount of pressure on those countries within the world. Not so much, obviously, its stated enemies like Russia and China, but certainly the other nations through the SWIFT bank interbank lending system, the SWIFT banking financial system, and it's one of the fears that they've got. I suppose they're not going to be suspended. The United Nations as a body, as a functioning body, is finished. I've become a little bit weary of the kind of rhetoric from UN officials. I think it's well intentioned, but there has to be a concerted effort now to take action. I mean, in the past, when you had a seemingly impossible conflict to find a solution to, you would have United Nations peacekeepers going in there en masse to keep the two warring sides apart. Why are we not seeing UN peacekeepers in Palestine? Why are we not seeing them in other parts of the world as well, where ultimately American military, political and economic power is being exerted? It's because the US is still the dominant military and economic power in the world, and no one wants to noise them up, I suppose. But I think BRICS is going to change all that. The BRICS countries coming together, because that's where ultimately global economic power is decided. And if we can see an alternative to American economic influence, then that's going to be a positive thing for the rest of the world. How the US responds could dictate how unsavory the whole thing becomes ultimately.
Yeah. The problem for the US is that they can be biting off more than they can chew, Lloyd, and they're spoiling for a fight with China and Taiwan. They've got Ukraine going full tilt. They're trying to get Georgia going. And the other one's Moldova. This week now there was an election in Moldova, which the Americans' fingerprints are all over it. And the pro-West Sandu, the sitting president, was getting beaten quite comprehensively by the in-country vote. But then in came the outside country vote, and suddenly wallop, she won it. But the most interesting part of all that was 500,000 Moldovians live in Russia. They only sent 10,000 ballots to Russia. But, the Americans want to teach everyone about democracy, and the West wants to teach them about democracy. Absolutely rigged.
Yeah. I mean, that's a classic. This past week or 2 weeks in politics, towards the Ural Mountains, have been really, really important, and we've heard next to nothing from the BBC, from Sky, from mainstream media, and this is where not having Russia Today actually has a big effect, because we didn't know about the attempt to suborn the election in Georgia. We were unaware of the attempt to suborn the election in Moldova as well. Now, if our population was seeing these things and were able to put two and two together, they would see, we'd maybe be able to get people to reassess their approach to what's happening in the Ukraine. Because in some ways, what's happened in Moldova and what happened in Georgia is using exactly the same kind of tactics as was used in the Ukrainian playbook
That's good enough.
And so Greta
The big guns have been moved in.
You know, the smallest rent-a-crowd Bartommy Robinson you could get. So she's there, and the journalist asked her, Greta, you know, you're the great environmentalist. Why are you here? I'm here to protect the people of Georgia. What are you here to protect the people of Georgia from? The interference in their democracy. At which point, someone who clearly understood English, who was standing to the right of the journalist, burst out laughing. And all you heard in the background was, well, isn't that what you're doing, Greta? You know, and in some ways, it really encapsulated the whole thing. But I think this, you know, what Mark said earlier, what we've all said earlier is, how is America going to respond? This is America's response. What's happening in Moldova and Georgia is America's response to the failure in the Ukraine. It's this ongoing pressure that they're trying to put onto Russia, which you know, if you were to ask the ordinary man in the street in Chicago or Los Angeles or downtown Macon, Georgia, whether or not they think enormous amounts of the American budget should be spent on trying to rig elections in countries in Middle Europe, I don't think they would find that as a big priority. And I think maybe the big change that's coming is America is becoming, the American state is becoming so completely separated from its own population that maybe that's where the change in America is going to come, and it's going to come from an internal change. We can but hope, I would say.
Well, they are talking, Mark, about, I mean, there's a chance of civil war here. I mean, America professes to be the democracy for all democracies. Now, even going back to that Moldovan one, as soon as the polling stations closed, they were able to give an indication. At that time, as I say, the opposition guy was in front. But the US, I was reading, some states won't declare for up to 3 or 4 weeks. This is supposed to be the mother of democracy. There's talk about there's algorithms being fixed so that the voting machines will make sure that Trump doesn't win. They really have got a cheek trying to teach anyone about democracy when their country is flawed beyond belief as a democracy.
Well, it's the last year in particular has democracy has never been an absolute panacea for equality and fairness. You know, I think one of the issues you've got in the United States is, it's the money that talks. The money's always talked in US elections, and I'm not entirely sure, would there be a civil war? I think you could see events could transpire that could certainly ignite a major problem for the US. But I think what they'll do is, and we saw it during the Vietnam conflict as well, with the protests, university campuses being protests on university campuses being put down by the National Guard, resulting in them opening fire on people. And you might, Berkeley University, and you might be, you might have thought that might have resulted in a bit of blowback onto the US authorities. There has been attempts. I think it's so disconcerted. I did an interview some years ago with Robert Baer, who was the former CIA bureau chief. He was director of the CIA in the Middle East, and he was very candid in saying that the United States population can't deal with complexity. They like things black and white. It's how their whole propaganda. I mean, propaganda is not just about news. We've got well documented evidence now of how Hollywood films have been used explicitly and funded in many cases by the US government to present a certain narrative of how America is. where, you know, I think Frankie Boyle did a kind of sketch on it, didn't he, a few years ago, where he said, oh, you know, like they only do these wars so they can make a film 10 years later about, oh, how they were so sorry for killing all these poor children and civilians, and it's played on their minds ever since. I mean, that's the concept of America as the good guy, even when blatantly they're not. They clearly are not the good guys on the global stage. They've caused misery. They've overthrown, since the end of the Second World War, over 50 countries have been overthrown by the US, and many of them were democracies. So they have no regard for what most ordinary, reasonable people would regard as democracies. Where it'll go, I think this could be one of the most interesting presidential elections in a long time. But I suspect that the nature of American, at high governmental level, of their predisposition to using violence and using an overwhelming military response to any potential threat to the integrity of their country would be pretty swift. So I don't know. It depends. As if senior military commanders in the US, depends what way they go. You know, it's not inconceivable you could see some kind of military coup dressed up with a political front. Well, it's going to be interesting. Conversation stopper.
Yeah, my screen froze. I couldn't do anything. It just froze there for a second. I apologise to everyone. Lloyd, I was looking there recently. In fact, yesterday, Condoleezza Rice, remember the ex-State Department woman, who was talking about all the wonderful, magnificent things that Ukraine's been doing. There's still this narrative in the West that Ukraine is winning, or at least not losing, when we know for a fact they're losing dramatically. And I remember reading from Colonel Douglas MacGregor, about two particular places to watch for, and they are Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, because apparently in the Donbass, these are two of the last high parts of. From there on, it's rolling plains, and once those positions are taken, then the whole of the Donbass is open to the Russians. Now they're already attacking those places from north, south, east, and they're closing, and an encirclement's going on in both of those places. There's some people saying by November, by the end of this month, that the war could effectively be over. You know, that is a strong possibility. Will they keep fighting on, or will they keep going to, when they get to Odessa? That's a Russian city. Do they want that before they say enough?
I really don't know about the detail of what will be acceptable to the Russians, other than what Lavrov has said and what President Putin has reiterated, which is they will not give up ground, and they will expect the full denazification of the Ukraine, no Ukrainian membership of NATO, and the removal of the current regime. I mean, you know, what sane person wouldn't want all of those things? The war is effectively over, and I think the silence from the West on Ukraine particularly tells us that. With regard to the two places that you referred to, that Colonel MacGregor mentioned, from what I was looking at last night and in preparation for today, it would appear that both of those towns, both of those areas are on the point of falling. Mm-hmm. And it would appear from people who know this stuff better than I do, that what the Russian military are effectively doing is they are allowing the Ukrainians a window of opportunity to withdraw. Because once those two towns fall and we're into winter, there will be no major war. There will be no major conflict on the ground during the winter period. There may be stuff that goes on in the air, but on the ground it will stop. And what they're saying is this, that the degradation of the power grid, the degradation of the power stations right across the Ukraine, coming into this winter, effectively mean that the country is on the brink of social collapse, or will be on the brink of social collapse by the end of November, with massive power outages, inability to clean their water, they're basically, the infrastructure of the Ukraine is beginning to collapse. And I think it's clear in that Russia is not going to press the case during the winter period. I think yet again, and we've mentioned this before, in some ways Russia could finish this and it could finish it now. But what would be the outcome the other side of it? Because, you know, America doesn't have a border with the Ukraine. Who's going to deal with the refugees? Because there will be refugees. There will be huge amounts of people when eventually Ukraine collapses. There will be large amounts of people who will no longer want to be in Ukraine. Where are they going to go? Are they going to go to Belarus? Are they going to go to Russia? Are they going to go to Donetsk? Are they going to go to Poland, Austria, Czech Republic, Slovakia? Where are these people going to go? There's been no preparation made to deal with us in any kind of a way. The other thing I would say about the Ukraine is this. There are far too many people in this country who bought into a story. They bought into the story of plucky little Ukraine being defeated by the great, horrible Russian bear. And they put flags up in their windows, and they collected money and they collected blankets for a Western European civilization country that does not have the same infrastructure problems as the people of Palestine. So we put up Ukrainian flags, we collected money, we sewed camouflage nets, and we brought lots of Ukrainians to the United Kingdom to give them solace in this period of war. When it came to the mass slaughter of Palestinians, did I see the same reaction from the population? Were suddenly the windows of Edinburgh bedecked in the flags of Palestine as they are still bedecked with the flags of Ukraine? No, because the mainstream media and our government wanted sympathy for Ukraine, but was not prepared to drive the same kind of concept of sympathy and care for the Palestinian people. And in some ways, that really encapsulates what Britain has become. That if you're white and anti-Russian, we will stand by you. But if you're not quite white and you're anti-Zionist, we'll provide the bombs to kill you.
It is quite disgusting, Mark. But the one thing about the West, and it's getting more and more obvious every day, is the hypocrisy and double standards. And when it comes to international law, till it comes to war, till it comes to invading Palestine's okay, invading Ukraine's not okay. All those things that Lloyd there's alluded to, but it's blatant double standards and hypocrisy, isn't it?
Well, I think that hypocrisy has always actually been there. I don't think it's a new development. I think what's changed everything, and it's why we're seeing less than casual threats to control, regulate, and effectively close down social media, is because social media has been able, it's all really been well said by others, but the genocide taking place in Gaza, in Palestine, is the first one that we're watching in real time. But despite that, there is a sense of powerless. I don't think we are powerless. I actually think Zionism, the American project instigated by the British, with the establishment of Israel, has definitely gone way beyond any reasonable standard that could be acceptable. And I think they've actually sown the seeds of their own demise ultimately in this, because the huge tragedy is of that particular conflict specifically is that there are children not even born today that will be seeking revenge for what America and its little racist genocidal proxy has done in Palestine decades and decades from now. And unless there is some consequence on those who have perpetrated that genocide, then that's unavoidable, an absolutely unavoidable scenario that's going to play out, and it's going to play out, unfortunately, on civilian populations in the West. They'll be the number one target. That's what these governments, supposedly democratic representative governments, have done to their own populations, is paint a massive target on their back and the backs of their children and their children's children. That's the horror what's going on. And until that's reined in, it's a terrifying prospect. The world looks a pretty scary place at the moment. And we're in a perpetual state of crisis. And again, it's because we're ruled over by people whose personal wealth makes them feel immune to the consequences.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And Zionism is a terrible thing. Here's we talked earlier about Mark mentioned Lloyd about the weather here. We've had some terrible tragedies. But here, this came out. Zionists were laughing at 158 Spanish because Spain had the audacity to recognise Palestine. Now, can you imagine if the Russians were to do something similar, or the Chinese, what would happen? And another one just to put was this, because time's getting against us, and I would like to really discuss it. This Israeli soldier admitted to CNN about driving a bulldozer over hundreds of Palestinians with bulldozers. And actually, the whole point of the article and the thing on it was the trauma he was feeling and how terrible he felt after he had done this. It wasn't about how horrific it was for the people who were killed by a bulldozer. And I should incidentally say men, women, and children.
No, it's the dehumanization of an entire culture and civilization. The dehumanization of the Palestinians by the Israelis, began a long, long time ago. And the appalling thing about it is, and the more and more Israel does what it does, what Israel accuses everybody else of, it was the first perpetrator of. That's the way it works with Israel. It does something and then accuses other side of having done it. When was the first car bomb in history? Israeli terrorists. The first suitcase bomb? Israeli terrorists. The first targeted assassination of a United Nations official? Israeli terrorists. Look, we could spend hours and hours, unfortunately and horrifically, outlining the very specific and brutal and foul war crimes committed by the Israeli occupying forces. I watched something the other day about a doctor who had spent 3 months in Gaza talking about children being shot in the head, but we're not talking about 11 and 12-year-olds. The deliberate choice of an Israeli sniper to shoot at a 6-month-old child. And this is not a single, it's not one event. This is an ongoing process, as I kind of alluded to earlier on. What Israel's trying to do is kill as many people as it possibly can, and more importantly, kill the people who could create more children. And it's a calculation for Israel. If you kill enough of them, there won't be enough of them to fight us in 20 years. So all we have to do is keep them penned up for another 20 years, and then it's all over and done with. And that's how they're thinking. And that's how, the dehumanization of the Palestinians by the Israelis leads them to being able to do that, to turn the whole thing into an arithmetic exercise about their own protection. I mean, the picture of the bulldozer, my first experience, or my second experience of the Israeli Defense Force was in 2002, when I got into the refugee camp in Jenin on the morning that the Israelis were withdrawing. They'd been there for 2 weeks, and in that 2 weeks, they'd completely obliterated a refugee camp, which was about the size of maybe 8 football pitches, all put together. Now, these had been 4 or 5-story houses. They blew them up, flattened them down, and then spent 2 weeks using that very bulldozer from that very picture that you just showed, rolling over the top of that until it was entirely and completely flat, right? What had previously been the homes of 8,500 people turned into a car park, but done deliberately. Staying there for the 2 weeks to crush down and crush down and crush down was like a metaphor for what the Israelis had been doing to the people of Jenin since 1947. Now, what can we say? What can we say about the horrors that Israel has carried out over the 75, 80 odd years? Or do we speak specifically of what they're doing now? I think we need to speak specifically of what they're doing now, because what's clearly happening with the connivance of the British government, the United States, the European Union, and Mrs. van der Leyen is we are giving the Israelis the opportunity to eradicate an entire culture and population, which is what they want to do.
Yeah. it's quite truly appalling. Mark, we're coming towards the end here. The one thing that we've been talking about, there is in Ukraine, there's an opportunity the Russians can militarily end that and finish it. That is a strong possibility. There's also the possibility that Trump wins and he withdraws funding, and that forces Ukraine to end the conflict. And, you know, there has to be a negotiation, denazification, all those things have to happen. So there's several routes that can end in Ukraine. I cannot see one in the Middle East where there is any kind of end to this unless Turkey and Egypt and Saudi and all these other countries that won't do anything all unite and take out Israel. There is no other alternative, is there?
Well, yeah, I think we've got to be realistic as well. A lot of the Arab countries, their leaderships are very much in the pocket of the United States. They have been for a long time. The big difficulty, I think, for them, and it's one of the reasons, because Israel, when they launched this retaliatory, as they believe, a retaliatory strike against Iran, it was limited. They wanted to go much further. But the US, and again, this was covered in an interview I was involved with some years ago with Bob Baer, when we were talking about specifically the 1988 bombing of Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie. And it was very clear, Western intelligence knew within a week that Iran had sponsored the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command to carry out that attack in retaliation for the shoot down by the United States of Flight 655 just 8 months before. And it was put to Bob Baer, who was Middle East director for the CIA at the time, well, why on earth did the US not go after Iran? And he was very candid. He says, for the very same reason they won't go after them today, because of the positioning of Iran, they can close the Straits of Hormuz in a week. And within a month, the United States economy would go into its deepest recession in its history. He said, if US politicians want to attack Iran, they've got to be prepared to ride bicycles for the next 10 years. 5% of our global crude oil comes out of Iran, but 20% goes through the Straits of Hormuz. The Iranians are well capable of littering the Straits of Hormuz with sea mines, and not one ship will go through that channel. And the whole, obviously, it wouldn't just be the United States, the whole global economy would be in peril. And that's why they were showing restraint. Now, I notice the Iranians are making clear they will strike back. The Iranians, historically, have always chosen to avoid a direct conflict. And they've always outsourced in the past any retaliation against the West. But it's a very different dog. Iran is not Iraq. If the US go into Iran, if they attack Iran militarily, it's going to be much, much worse than any conflict the United States has been in since its inception. And that's the danger. And the consequences globally, you know, these things can rattle out very, very quick. They can unravel. The rule of unintended consequences can unfold very, very rapidly. And I don't know if there's the intellectual depth in the United States to really think, yeah, they game plan all the time, but to really think what potentially could happen if they do that. So, yeah, as for a resolution, resolution in Palestine, I think the reality is there's no military response going to stop the Israelis from what they're going to do. And they're going to go beyond Gaza. They're going to go beyond the West Bank. They're going to push into southern Lebanon. And then once they've done that, they'll start expanding everywhere else, because that's been the whole aim of Israel in the first place, a foothold for the West, the United States specifically, to expand their influence, their power, and to ultimately seek an economic benefit to that. So it's a dark place we're in.
It is. I wish we could leave you with something to say, folks, to cheer you up, but this is the reality. So I hope this has been informative for you, as it has been for me, as always, having such brains here to fill my empty head. I appreciate it. Mark, Lloyd, thanks very much. And to you folks, till we see you again, you and yours, take care.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.